This is part 6 in a series of videos in which I am repairing and restoring an ASR33 teletype. In this video I had intended to get onto the electronics pack, but I've been asked to explain how the keyboard mechanism works and also how to reassemble it, so that's what I'm going to do in this video. What I've done so far is I've completely stripped the unit down. I've taken all the encoder bars out, cleaned them, I've put them back in, lubricated them, I've tested all the switches. I'll come back to these in a few minutes. I've spent quite a bit of time cleaning up all the keys, and they've come up pretty much like new. They're in very nice condition now. They were all almost completely white. The front cover I've also spent a lot of time polishing. So the way I went about this was very badly discoloured. It was almost orange. Using 3000 grade abrasive paper, this is immersed in water, and then with a large felt pad I flat the surface, and you end up with a flat but very dull finish. There were some very deep scratches in this, and as I say, it was badly discoloured, so I kept going until I'd got down to almost the original colour. You can see the original colour on the top here, and we're very close to it, so I don't want to go too far and remove too much material. So it was just really getting it back into good condition. And then I spend about 2 hours polishing it with Nervous number 2, and it don't know how well it's coming across, but it's almost completely removed all the scratches. Very nice finish, almost like new, not quite, but very close, but certainly a lot better than it was. Cleaned all the keys, and what I'm going to do now is explain, as I say, in some detail how this mechanism works. Now, this explanation isn't just for the ASR33. Most teletypes of this era worked on very similar principles. The implementation was often very different, but the general principle of operation was the same. So I'm just going to zoom the camera in a bit, and we'll have a closer look at this mechanism, which is the key to how the data is encoded from the keyboard. Okay, so the keyboard, really, the whole purpose of this mechanism is just to manipulate this series of switches on the end here. And so the way the switches are arranged is we have a common contact bar, which is the part behind the switch contacts that these wires are connected to. And then you have these little spring fingers. I'll just bring the light down a bit, hopefully better see this a bit better. And you then have these plastic T-levers, and the encoder bars that we see here, their entire purpose is just to manipulate the position of the T fingers, and those in turn set the switches to either open or closed, and that sets the code that we want that particular key to encode. Anyone that's seen the previous series of videos that I posted on the first ASR33 will notice that on the other keyboard there were some contacts on this end of the mechanism, and the switches on this end are for parity information. So there are two basic versions of this keyboard from this era. You have this version, which is the non-parity, and it just generates basic code for the key that's pressed. And then on the other version, which is what I showed in the first series of videos, there is the parity version of the keyboard that has contacts down at this end, and it generates parity information for each code. If you do work on these, as well as the omission of the switches for parity, you should also bear in mind that the order in which the bits are encoded also changes. It's different for the parity and non-parity versions of the keyboard, so just bear that in mind. Okay, so the way this works is it looks very complicated. It's actually quite simple. Each of these rockers at the end is connected to two encoder bars. You can see if I rock this one, the two bars move up and down, so it's these two here, and they alternate. One goes up, the other goes down, and then there's a whole series of these, and they're all in pairs. So each one of these has a pair of encoder bars. So if we look at the first pair of encoder bars, then you can see that as each one moves up and down, we have a series of these little fingers on each one, and you'll also notice that they always alternate. So that is, whenever the front bar has a raised section, the rear section has a lowered section. So what these are for is whenever you press a key, so if I take a key, we'll take the Q, and the Q would normally sit here. So when you press the key down, it presses down on one or more of these raised sections. So if I press this key down, in fact what I'll do, I'll put the key into the keyboard. Okay, so that key is now fitted to the keyboard. So if we just put the encoder bars into random positions, whenever I press the key down, this is the Q key, then it pushes down on all the raised tabs. So it sets some of the front encoder bars down and some of the rear encoder bars down. Now when I release the key, there's a spring that the key's sitting on that will raise the key, but notice that the bars all stay in the same place, and every time a particular key is pressed, irrespective of the position of the encoder bars, they always end up in the same position for each key that's pressed. So for each bit, as I say, each of these pairs represents one of the data bits, and for each bit the front bar being down represents a 1 and the rear bar being down represents a 0. Also along the front we have this common bar, and that is pressed down irrespective of which key you press. So if I push that down manually, you'll see this lever over here will pop up. Okay, and the back end of that lever goes here, and this connects through the H-link that we mentioned in the previous video to the printer mechanism. So whenever you press a key, this little tab will pop up. That operates this link that goes through the H-link to the printer. It triggers the printer into starting a print cycle, and at the end of the print cycle the printer will reset this link. So if I do that again and press the key down, it triggers the printer, and at the end of the print cycle this is reset and the keyboard is enabled again. So the purpose of this is when you press the key down, although when you release the key pops up, through the mechanism connected to the common bar, it's the one that goes all the way across the front, this pops up, that effectively locks out the keyboard, so now you can't press any other keys until you press or release or reset the keyboard, and then it frees them all up again. Now the reason there are 2 encoder bars for each bit, there's 2 main reasons. One is because it means that you can go directly from one key combination to another without having to reset the combinations. In other words, if we go from Q and then reset, now although I've reset the keyboard, all the encoder bars are still where they were, but you can now select a different combination, so we could in theory press down a different key and that would go straight through to the new code without having to go through to a reset position first. And that means that it's far more efficient in terms of the speed that it will operate at. So just to clarify that, we can go from Q, reset the keyboard, and then directly through to whatever key this should be without having to go back to a reset position first. So that's one of the reasons that that mechanism is used. Another reason is, if you think about it, if we set a particular key combination, we'll press Q again, the keyboard is now locked out. In other words, the encoder bars are in their kind of locked position. And that means that because all the codes are unique for each key, for every other key, at least one of these tabs, either on the front or the back encoder bar, will be raised. So if we look at this particular key, notice that this tab is raised and this tab is raised, and because they're locked, it means we can't now press down this key. It'll go a little bit, but it won't press down beyond a certain point, and it won't move the encoder bars until we release the keyboard, and now it will go down. And now, because the keyboard is effectively locked again, then we can't press down the Q key. It'll go down so far, but now the key's hitting this tab and this one, so it won't go down until we reset the keyboard. Okay, so that's why there are two encoder bars for each key. It enables us to go directly from one code to another without going through a reset, and also it enables us to lock all the keys up apart from the one that's currently being processed. And you have to do that because it takes the printer quite a long time to print the character, and you don't want someone to kind of overspeed the mechanism and press down one key while the previous one is being processed. Okay, so let's get this key out of the way. Okay, now the next thing is, how is the data actually encoded? And as I said, this varies between the different versions of this keyboard. The parity and non version encode it in a slightly different way. The actual code values are the same, but the order of the bits is different. And so if we look at the switches on the end, for the purpose of the data that's being sent, the switches we're interested in are this one. This is bit 1. The bits are numbered 1 through 7 in the manual, 7-bit code of course. So you've got this one, which is bit 1. If I rock the rocker about, you can see moving that particular switch. Just unlock the keyboard. The next one along is actually spring loaded, so when I push it down, you notice it always goes back to the original position, and that's the shift. And because the shift is a non-latching code, and you'll notice that it's really fairly common for all the keys. The back encoder bar is pretty much 0 for every single key. So we can ignore that one as far as the code is concerned. So the first one, the first switch is bit 1. We'll skip the shift. The next one, this one that's now moving, is bit 2. The next one is bit 3, etc. So the order of these is we've got bit 1, bit 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So what we can now do is look at the actual data values that are going to be encoded for a given series of encoder bars. So firstly, if we, for example, press down the Q key, so I'm going to depress the Q key, we've now locked the value into the switches. Okay, so I've got the Q key held down, and if I just slightly move the interlock lever, you'll see some of the key switches are moving. We can ignore the first one, that's the shift. But if we now look at the remainder, you'll see that the first one, bit 1, is moving, so that's a 1. So if I write this down, we've got 1. The next 3, which is this one, and this one, are not moving, so that's 3 zeros. Okay, the next one, which is this one, is moving, the next one's not moving, and the next one is moving. So what we're getting now is a 1, 0, 1. As I say, 7-bit code. Now, the value that's encoded is, starting at bit 1, is 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1. And if we look at the character set for this machine, we know this is the Q key. I've got the key in, although the cap's got Q in it, it's the position in the keyboard that's important, not what's written on the cap. But it's in the Q position, so what we've got is bit 1, it should be 1, followed by 3 zeros, 1, 3 zeros, and then bits 5 through 7 should be 1, 0, 1, which they are. If we try another character, so I'll move the Q key, and because the keys alternate between being hooked at the front and hooked at the back, I'm going to move it across to the next position for this type of key. So I'm going to take that out, reset the keyboard, and I'm going to put it into this position and not the keyboard. So the next position along, although it's got Q on the cap, as I say, it's not what's on the cap that's important, it's where it is in the keyboard. And this is actually in the key number 2 positions. This would be normally where the 2 key would reside. And if I now make sure the keyboard's unlocked, press this down, get a piece of paper back. So I'm going to press the key down. We've got our new code, and if I rock this about, you'll see that some of the keys are moving and some are not. So we've got the first one isn't moving. Write that down. Skipping over the shift key, which is the shift is moving, but you can ignore that. And then the next one we're interested in is this one, which is moving. Then we've got 2 that aren't, and the next one is. Okay, and then we've got one that is, one that isn't. So that's the combination we're now getting for this particular key position. And again, if we go back to the instruction set, as I said, this should be the number 2 key, which is this one. And if we look, we should be getting 0, 1, 0, 0. We're getting 0, 1, 0, 0. And then the other bits are 1, 1, 0. 1, 1, 0. So as you can see, it's quite easy to determine what the code should be and if it's working. Now, in addition to that, if you've accidentally mixed up these code bars, it is quite easy to figure out which one's which. There is normally a number stamped on them, but if you're not quite sure, what you can do is, for example, write down the order of the keys that go into the keyboard. So starting from the left, in fact, if we start in this position, this is the number 2 position. So if we start off with 2 and then write down the order of the keys that we expect, if you remember what order these go in, it saves a lot of time. Otherwise, I recommend taking a reference photo before you take it apart. But I've done a lot of these, so I can remember the order of the keys. But it's a fairly standard layout. Also, the keys in each row are different. Obviously they're physically different, you can't really mix them up, and well, you can, but you'd end up with a very weird looking keyboard. So you'll know straight away if you've got the right key. But going from this, the order that we expect to see these would be 2, the next one would be Z, and then looking at the order that we expect the keys to be in, we'll get W, S, 3, X. And they're the order that the keys are put into the keyboard in. So what you can do is look at each bit in turn with this information. Okay, so now going back to the character set, if we look for bit 1, the value we should have for the 2 key, which is the one that, so that's got Q on the cap. This is in the key 2 position. If we follow this across, then we should have a 0 encoded for this particular key. So the front encoder bar should be low, and the rear one, which is the one that should be pushed down, should be high. And you can see that is actually the case. So if I try to raise this, you can see that the rear encoder bar has got a tab on it. If we look at the next key, it's Z. And if we look at the expected bit for Z, again, that's a 0, and you can see once again that the rear encoder bar for the next position along is a 0, so it's the rear encoder bar that has the raised section. The next key would be W, so looking at W key and following that across, we should have a 1. So in this case, the raised section should be on the front encoder bar. So looking at this position, we're now here, so it's now this position. So as you can see, the raised section is in fact on the front encoder bar, which is this point here. We'll do one more, the S key. If we find S up here, follow it across, again we should have a 1. That's this position, and again this is the front encoder bar, and it is the front bar that has the raised section, therefore it's encoding a 1. You can do that all the way across, and if you just follow the sequence through, so what you can do is just write down the expected values, so you'd have 0, 0, 1, 1, and then you can find the encoder bar that matches. And all you need to do, and the front and rear encoder bars are physically different in terms of their ends, so you can see the front encoder bar and the rear encoder bar. And all you do is, once you've found the front encoder bar that matches the expected code for all the keys, you find the complement for the rear encoder, so every time there's a raised section on the front there should be a lowered section on the rear. And that's how you can tell which encoder bar is which. If you put them in the wrong order, you'll end up with an Enigma machine. It will just give out garbage. But it is fairly easy to figure out exactly what order the encoder bar should be in. So that's how all this works. Now there is of course a bit more complication to this, because there are features such as the break key here is Control Alt, that sort of thing. Incidentally, while we're talking about the here is key, this is the lever that normally sits on the printer. I've repaired this. This is one I mentioned that just gets pressed down but otherwise is not involved in anything. That normally just sits underneath the here is key. So that would normally sit under here, and when you push down the here is key it just pushes down on this. This doesn't do anything else, it's not connected to the keyboard in any other way, it's there purely to push down this lever. Okay, so hopefully that explains how this all works. It's very easy to check the contacts, especially when you've got it dismantled like this. You can just connect a multimeter across the common rail and the keys in turn. You can rock the encoder bars to operate the key contact and see if it's making and breaking the way it should do. These should all move freely. As I say, the shift key is spring loaded, it should always return, and the rest will stay in whatever position you put them in. When you press the key, this little lever on the right should pop up in response to the common bar at the front being pressed down, and it should move fairly easily and freely. If it's binding, then you need to free that off, otherwise the keyboard won't work correctly. Quite often you'll find when you take these apart that the springs, some of the keys have springs on them. Most of the keys are sprung on a like these little spring plates on the bottom, but some have actual springs on them like this, and quite often you'll find that they are pushed through the little slots they're supposed to sit in. So there's little cutouts that the key plunger sits in, so this section should normally sit through a slot in the base, but quite often the springs have been pushed part way through that slot, and it's because I think when people reassemble these they'll put it on like this, and then they'll try to kind of manipulate it through like this, and it's very difficult because the thing's moving about and you can't really see it. The way you're supposed to do this is when you put the spring onto the shaft, push it on, and then you can kind of get it captive on this little cutout. That's one of these little cutouts here. It doesn't really perform any purpose when the keyboard's assembled, it's just for assembly. So put the spring onto the shaft, pull it across so it's captive in this little cutout, and then the first time you push the key all the way down it will release it, and it will then go back into its normal position, and then it will act as a spring, but otherwise it will pop off like that and disappear across the room. So if you get it captive before you put this in, it really makes assembly much easier. And there's a few keys like this, and once they're hooked in it's fine, but trying to get it in with the spring extended is quite difficult. So just hook it onto this little cutout, put it into place, and then push it all the way down. That will release the spring and it will go back into its normal operation. Okay, so hopefully that explains how the keyboard works. What we're going to do now is reassemble this. Reassemble is actually quite easy, but I'll go through and just show you how to get the keys in the right order, and then we can put the top cover on and this will be complete. So assembling this is actually very easy. Start off by fitting the specific keys. Some have specific positions, and as I say, what you need to do is either make a sketch or take a reference photo before you take this apart so you know where the keys go. Failing that, just look online. There are plenty of photographs showing the keyboards on the ASR33, and although there are two versions of this keyboard and the switches are in different positions, the keys are all in the same positions. There are some variations, but in general it's very easy to figure out what goes where. Bear in mind that the O and the 0, there was some ambiguity in the way they looked on these very early keyboards. In fact, on the previous series somebody asked me if I'd mixed two of them up. I hadn't, and in fact it's impossible to mix those two keys up. The keys there are four different versions of the keys in terms of their physical arrangement, so there are four different versions of this bracket, and it makes it impossible to get these in the wrong position unless you are out quite a long way. And some hook on the front, so you've got these hooks on the front, and some hook on the back, and they alternate front to back. So all you need to do is to know what order the keys should go in. Now if we take the front cover, you'll notice that if we draw a vertical line, then you can see that in terms of the row, the key order is the second row down. That's the key that has to go in, and they have to go in the order of the physical spacing. So if you number them, imagine you're numbering the rows from 1 through 4, then the first row will be the second one down, the next one is the third one down, the next one is the top, and then the last one is the bottom. So if you were to number these, they would effectively be 1, 2, 3, 4, and then it starts again. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and you just keep repeating that order. So start off by getting the weird shaped keys in. So you've got the Alt, Control, here is repeat and break, and they're not really directly on the encoder bars, they operate the mechanism at the end, so it's fairly easy to distinguish those. Once you've got it to this point and you have the 5 special keys fitted, then the next key, or the first key we're interested in putting in, will be the number 1 key. So we've got Alt, Control, that takes us from row 1, 2. If you remember, the next one is the top one, that's 3, and the first key on that row is key 1, so that's this key. Okay, let's check, make sure they're straight before we put them in. In fact, some of these were bent, so I'll have to straighten some of these out. And to fit them, all you need to do is locate them. The tang on the bottom goes through the hole onto the spring plate. Doesn't go through that slot. That slot's not used in this particular keyboard at this point, but it goes through this first spring plate hole. Make sure it's the right way up. The tang at the front goes into the vertical slot, does not go into the enclosed loop, it goes into the open slot. So it will go through into that position, and then all you need to do is make sure that it engages when you push it in with the slot on the back. Now if it's not going to go down because it's tight, make sure the keyboard is reset, so make sure this lever's down. So if it seems like the key's very tight, just push that lever down, and you should be able to push these in very easily. It will, in general, when you push the key down, it will set the keyboard, so just push the lever down again before you do the next key, and you should find that this will now move and it will reset. If you want to make sure that you've got the first key in the right position, because of course all the remaining keys will be in the wrong place. If this one's wrong, then you can of course just look at the keys that are set, or the switches that are set when the keys pressed down, and see if that matches what you expect for key number 1 in the character set. Okay, so we've got key 1, and the next one we need to put is the row 4, what we've defined as row 4, and in this case that is the left shift key, and it goes in exactly the same way apart from the hook on this one is at the front. So again, it will go into this position, make sure the keyboard is reset, and then you can push this down. It should go in fairly easily. If you have to force it then something's wrong, and this should operate the shift, and this will be kind of a backup to whether you've got these in the right place. If we press this one, remember the shift is the spring-loaded encoder bars, so we should now find that when we press shift down it moves the spring-loaded encoder bars, and that's the ones that are moving, so we know that's in the right place. Okay, so that was row 4. We now go back to row 1, and in row 1, which is the second row down, we should record the QWERTY keyboard, so the first key is going to be Q, so that will be our Q key, and that goes into the next available slot. So it goes into this position, make sure the keyboard is reset, make sure the tang goes into the cutout at the bottom, reset the keyboard, and now we've got that key in as well. So the next one down is the third row, and the first character after control on that row is the A key, so I need to find the A key, which is this one, and again this one hooks on at the front. Make sure the keyboard's reset, put this into the next available position. Okay, and that then gives us our A key. The next one is key number 2, which is, this is now row 3, our defined row 3. So try and find key 2, which is this key, and that goes into the next position. Okay, so that's all I'm going to do, just work my way across all the keys, putting them into the right location, going through them in order, rows 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, keep going across until we have all the keys replaced and they're in the order that they should be in for this keyboard. So it takes about 10 minutes, it's a very quick operation. It looks complicated the first time you do it, but it's very straightforward, so I'll get that done. I'll do that off camera. I won't bore you showing fitting all these, and then we'll get back and fit the remaining parts. Okay, that's all the keys fitted, and again you can generally tell when you get to the end, if you press the shift key again, you should see the sprung encoder bar move. It's fairly obvious if you get just one out of sequence, because obviously they should all be the same height in each row. If you find that they are a long way out, then obviously you've made a mistake. And the key cap designators do vary over time with these keyboards, but in general, as I say, it's very difficult to get these out of sequence. You have to be a long way out to make a mistake and to be able to assemble the keyboard. Okay, so that's the general keys fitted. The next thing to do is fit the space bar. So we have two of these spring bars, there's one at each end, and as I say, if you put the spring into its captive position and then fit these into place, these fit on the ends in these slots, and the tab pokes out forward. There's one at each end. They are identical, but they both face forward. I'll get these two fitted, and then we can put the crossbar in and fit the key. So fitting these is fairly straightforward once you've done it a few times. So what you have to do is feed it so that the horizontal tang fits through the slot in the rear. So it goes in like that, and then this tang, you won't be able to see it, but there's a slot in the base that this fits through, and this is where you need to have the spring captive. If the spring's not captive, this is very difficult. So you need to get that tang to go through, and then I'll just get that. Okay, so the very end of the tang is going through the hole in the bottom of the keyboard. I don't think you'll be able to see it, but it's down there somewhere. And then this arrangement at the front, it looks like it won't go together, but it's kind of like a Chinese puzzle. When you get it into the right place, it will move across and then it will move down, and when you move it down it will release the spring, which it has done, and now that's in position. So it looks like it's very difficult to get in the first time you do it, but once you've done a few, then it is fairly straightforward. And the opposite end is identical. Just be sure, as I say, to put the spring into its captive position before you try and fit it, because otherwise trying to fight with the spring while you're doing this makes it extremely difficult. But once you've got it in the right place, then again it's just a matter of feeding this through. Make sure it goes through the correct slot at the rear of the keyboard, and pass the bottom end of the tang into its slot. And then once you've done that, you can bring the key into the correct position. So at the moment the spring is not active, but when you push this down it will release the spring, and it's now working the way it's supposed to. The next thing you have to do is fit the key and the crossbar. So the key, notice it's angled, so you can't really fit it the wrong way around, but it goes through the slot at the front of the keyboard. That will then move up and down, and this then fits through, and this key just hangs on this crossbar, but each end of the crossbar goes into one of the two spring levers that we've just fitted. Okay, so once they're fitted, the space key should do its thing. So whenever you press the space key down, it should encode a space, but it should work whichever end of the key you press. That's why there's a lever at both ends, so make sure that it works from end to end as well as the middle. Okay, so the next step is to fit the keyboard cover, and this is just really a case of persuading all the keys to go through their appropriate slot. The brake is the only one that's particularly difficult because it's spring loaded. Okay, now it's lined up. All we have to do, I've got a cable tie in here. This is just to hold this end plate has got springs on it that are part of the switch actuator mechanism. So if I cut this cable tie, this plate's going to want to pop off. I now need to cut it in order to allow the plate to come away so I can drop the cover on, and what we then have is a washer and a circlip. So there's only one in the center, there's nothing on these just pass through the slots. So I'm going to cut this cable tie, this plate will come away. I need to make sure all the keys come through the cover, let this drop down, and then I can engage this plate on these two lugs, and then we can put the circlip on. Okay, so as I say, as soon as I cut this, the plate's going to want to spring off, so I'm holding it in place. Let it come out a little bit, just far enough, and then we can lower the cover. Okay, we can then engage this with the end cover, put the washer on, followed by the circlip. Okay, that one's on, and then we do the same thing with the one on the other end. So that will just go on, same thing, washer and circlip, and then that's the keyboard reassembled. So there are a couple of tabs on the bottom of here, so engage those first, rock it up, align the tabs, and if I've done this correctly, all the keys should now work. So the shift keys shouldn't latch down. The two shift keys are actually different. The key caps are offset on the bracket, so if you get to this point and you find that the keys are binding, you've probably got them swapped over, so just swap them back, but they should move quite smoothly and freely. The brake key, the repeat, here is Control and Alt. They're not really latching keys, and you should find now that all the other keys, when you press them, they cause the latch lever to move up, and that will prevent you pushing any of the other keys down until you reset the keyboard. It should move smoothly without any resistance. Holding down the shift and pressing a key should also act smoothly, and so that looks fine, and we now have hopefully a fully finished and working keyboard. If you do attempt this, then it's a very time-consuming process. I think it's taken me about 18 hours in total to refurbish this keyboard, but it is well worth the effort. The difference it makes to the look and the feel of the machine is quite amazing, and it's, I think, the thing that makes the biggest visual impact on a restoration like this.